Hey guys, welcome back to the From Mourning to Meaning interview series, where we are learning how to break through intolerable grief and return to meaningful living. Today, I have with me Ryan Mulkowsky. Ryan, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Now, for those of you who don't know Ryan, he is a hospice chaplain, bereavement coordinator, and certified grief recovery specialist for a large hospice in the greater Atlanta, Georgia area. So that's a big load right there.
Yeah.
I know you do have about 15 years professional experience, not only in faith communities, but also healthcare settings.
Yes.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about that and how you even got here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started off working in faith community settings as a pastor, and I did various pastoral roles over a 10-year period. And one of those roles was pastoral care. So, caring for, the dying, for the sick, for those who are having either, spiritual issues or, mental health issues, getting them referrals to professionals. So anything where somebody was just going through a difficult time. A lot of my pastoral care work was very rewarding, but later on I realized that I really had a passion more for a healthcare setting. And one of those reasons is actually because of my dad. My dad is a retired respiratory therapist and worked in healthcare for over 40 years. And it was always kind of something he kind of plugged in my ear a little bit, like, hey, why don't you try chaplaincy, healthcare chaplaincy? And I was like, oh, that sounds neat. And so I actually did clinical pastoral education at a pediatric hospital. And I did my internship and residency and really was challenged by the work. It was difficult work, but it was very rewarding work, and it grew my skill set tremendously. And I started growing a passion slowly for working with the ill, and specifically working with the dying, and providing care to them, but also providing care to their families, because the families are just as much on this journey with the patient as the patient is themselves. And so I kind of shifted from outside of pastoral care work and outside faith community work, and actually some, you could call it coincidence, happenstance, divine intervention, but somehow fell into my first hospice chaplain job and bereavement coordination job. Or bereavement coordination is just providing grief services for families after they lose a loved one. And I've been doing that for several years, and it's been extremely rewarding. I have such a passion for it. And like I said, I think it was one of those things where I never thought I'd do hospice, but I think it's kind of a full circle moment, because I've actually had several family members who have died on hospice care. So from a very young age, I got to see hospice in the home setting, and I got to see hospice in a clinical setting. And I got to see my loved ones who were suffering with pain or other comorbidities actually get taken care of. And they weren't just getting taken care of physically, getting comfort, but they were also being provided emotional support, spiritual support, so that holistic support. And so I'm very passionate about hospice. I love what I do. I love providing support to families. And the reason why is because, unfortunately, we're all gonna face a loved one who dies, and we are gonna go on that journey one day ourselves. And so because this is a universal reality that we all face, we need people on the front lines providing care and support in all different types of ways. And I'm just doing my little part to provide some support to people who really need it.
Definitely. And it's not a little part, you're doing your big part. That is huge. And it's not awesome that it happened, but it's great that you're able to take from the experience you had growing up, having family in hospice, because now you know not only how you felt and how to help those that are going through it as the family, but also you've heard probably feedback from those family members that went through it and kind of saw what helped them go through it as well, comfortably.
Absolutely.
So, or as comfortable as can be, right?
Right.
So that kind of helps you as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm informed just as much from my personal experience as I am from my professional education. And that's very important, because I think the personal experience is what promotes and creates the compassion and the empathy that somebody needs to be a really effective caregiver. You can learn all you want, and learning is important. Don't get me wrong. I've studied for years, reading books, going to school, getting professional education, continuing education on how best to serve the grieving. But at the same time, me facing, loved ones and seeing them going through the death and dying process really opened up my eyes to, my own grief. And I've grieved many, many times over grandparents, aunts, uncles, friends, others in my life who have gone through this process, whether it was sudden death or, expected death, even though, look, you can prepare as long as you want. It's still a difficult road. But yeah, my personal experience, I think, informs me just as much, if not more, as what I've learned. Yeah.
Definitely. Now, I know you mentioned that not only is the family going through grief, but the
Yes.
patient is going through grief as well. So
Correct.
these are
Yep.
completely different roads of grief, completely different situations and symptoms or feelings in them. Can you explain to us a little bit about the patient's grieving road?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, I think the most familiar and popular model for a patient who goes through the death and dying process was formed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, in her work in working with hundreds and hundreds of patients. And she started seeing commonalities between all of her dying patients, and then wrote her famous book that is probably one of the most quoted books in the grief world, which is on death and dying. And she noticed 5 things that most patients went through in their death and dying process. And that would be denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. I think one of the misconceptions, though, and we'll get to this in a little bit, so I don't want to get ahead, but one of the misconceptions is a lot of people have used that model that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross developed, and they've put it on the grieving. So they've put it on the family members who are losing their loved ones, and the griever, the family member, has a completely different experience. But with the patient, a lot of them do deal with denial. Obviously, let's just say, you get to the doctor and you feel like you're doing great, and then all of a sudden a doctor sees some abnormality in a test and they go, okay, we're gonna have to look into this a little bit more. And then you're kind of like, oh my goodness, what's going on? And then you're kind of in this denial, like, it's probably nothing. Maybe they just got the test wrong, or maybe the test wasn't done correctly. But then as they're kind of discovering and investigating, looking into some abnormality, then you realize, for example, you have some diagnosis. Let's just say it's cancer, for example, and they find cancer in your body, and it's not benign, it's malignant. And so you're faced with this shock and this bewilderment of, oh my goodness, the doctor just told me that I have cancer. So you're dealing with kind of this denial at first, like, no, it can't be, it's got to be wrong, do another test. Maybe you mixed me up with another patient, I don't know. But then you might go through an anger phase, right? Obviously, you've learned that you have this life-limiting illness. So you thought you were going to live a much longer life. You then realize your life might be cut short because of this life-limiting illness. So you're very angry because, well, you want to live. And so now you're dealing with all of this emotional pain, this emotional suffering of, I'm not going to be able to see my grandkids or my kids grow up to graduate, get married, get their first job, have their children, all the milestones of life that people want in living a good life. And you're not going to get to see that happen with your loved ones. You're not going to be able to hang out with your friends. You might not be able to go on that trip that you had planned on. One of the saddest cases I had was I was providing extensive grief support to a spouse, and she had just retired 6 months prior to the husband, and the husband found out a week after he retired he was starting to feel sick, and so he went to the doctor, and the doctor said he had stage 4 cancer. And that he had less than 6 months to live. So they had all these plans to travel the world, live up their retirement, do all the things that they had been working so hard to work toward for 40 plus years. And then they find out he has less than 6 months to live, and he actually died 3 months after the diagnosis. And one of the things that the spouse talked about was that she just felt cheated. She was so angry that they had worked so hard. They did all the right things. They worked hard. They did what society told them and expected them to do. And now she doesn't have a husband, and her husband's gone. So that's just an example of kind of the anger that builds up with the patient and with the griever. Bargaining, those patients that they're just going to keep on fighting, right? You're going to fight, you're going to do chemo, you're going to do radiation, you'll do immunotherapy, you'll do clinical trials, you'll do whatever you can to live longer. Most people find themselves in that space when they first get diagnosed. And so you're bargaining like, okay, maybe I can get a year or 2 more, maybe I can beat this thing. Maybe I can get it into remission. But then if everything's not working and you've tried everything and then the cancer's still there or it's spreading, then you kind of go through this depression phase of having to deal with, okay, I am dying. There's nothing I could do about it. I gave it everything I could. And now I'm just sad. I'm in this deep state of sadness and despondency because I no longer am going to live this long, healthy, happy life that I once thought I was going to live. And then acceptance finally, which is working with the patient intensely to try to get them to a place where they can accept, not that it's okay. That's not what acceptance means. It doesn't mean saying it's okay. It means accepting the reality of the situation so you can move forward. And in the last months or years you may have left, making the most out of that, right? So engaging with your family, maybe getting to do, depending on your health and your strength, getting to do the things that you've been wanting to do, getting into a mindset of not, I'm just going to sit here and wait till I die and be despondent about it. But I'm going to make the most out of the little time that I have left because life is precious and because I want to spend it with the people that I love the most and doing the things that I love the most. And that's kind of the journey that as a chaplain or a social worker or a counselor or somebody engages with the patient about. That's what we're trying to do. So my background as a hospice chaplain. So what I'm trying to do is I try to identify if they have faith or religious belief, a spiritual belief system, trying to help them engage in their spirituality so that their spirituality can provide some comfort and some peace for them, as spirituality and faith does for billions and billions of people around the globe. So I try to, either provide that spiritual support myself or get their clergy to come to provide that support, get their faith community to come if they're connected to one to provide that support. I also engage with them in a thing called life review. So let's review your life. What are some of your regrets? What are some of the things you wish you would have done? What are some of the things that you want to right? If you did something wrong, what are some of the things you want to make right before you die? So for example, let's say a lot of times there's family dynamics at play. Maybe this patient has an estranged child, an estranged, friend or a loved one. So what can we do to try to facilitate maybe you saying the things that you need to say so that you can, make that right, so that you can find some peace knowing you did your best to try to mend or heal the relationship, or at the very least, just say, I'm sorry for how I treated you. I'm sorry for what I've done. Communicating those unsaid things, those things that give people pain and suffering, gives that person a freedom, gives the patient a freedom to feel more and more at peace. And that's kind of the whole goal of what I do with patients, is trying to cultivate a space so that they can find some peace in their journey, so that when they die in peace. They die knowing they did everything they could, they've said everything they can say, and they can just go on and move on. So that's kind of the work of a patient in their grief process. And we'll talk later about how the family member has a slightly different experience, but there's some similarities.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel, I could be wrong in this, of course, but I feel like until they go through those emotions, they're not able to get to that acceptance, right? But once they finally get to the acceptance, that's when they really are able to enjoy the remainder of their life. They're really able to put the most out of it, bring the most out of the little bit of time they have left, right?
Yeah, I believe that's correct. Yeah, absolutely. I think you have to engage in your emotional journey if you want to ever get to a place of acceptance or peace. I think if you don't engage with that, if you just say, I refuse to engage with how I feel, I don't think you could ever get there. A lot of therapists say that the only way out is through something. You can't avoid it, you can't go around it, you can't ignore it. You have to journey through something in order to get to the other side. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. And while you have been talking to these patients, has someone ever mentioned to you probably feeling bad about leaving their family or feeling guilty because they feel the family is going to suffer or anything of that sort?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the common things that I see, especially at the end of life. So I would say probably the last week or two of life. We see patients a lot of times, they might, be at the point where they're nonverbal, they're non-responsive, but they say that the very last sense, so we have 5 senses, right? So the very last sense that goes is hearing. So the person might not be able to see, the person might not be able to talk, the person might not be able to smell or taste, because obviously when you're in the death and dying process, you can no longer eat, you can no longer drink. You're going to get to the point in the death and dying process. But the very last thing to go, and it goes at the point of death, is hearing. So your loved one might not be able to talk, might not be able to see you, might not be able to have a conversation, but they can hear you. And so it's very important for family members to remember that your loved one hears you. So continue to play their favorite music, read their favorite sacred text, read their, just say comforting words to them. We love you. We'll miss you, but we want you to go in peace. One of the things that we talk about a lot is with family members is giving the patient permission to go. Because I think a lot of times patients, like you said, I think a lot of times patients do hold on as long as humanly possible because they feel like their loved ones are not going to be okay without them, or maybe there was some unsaid business, or maybe like a child or somebody that they love is going through a difficult time when that person was going through the dying process. And so they don't want to leave that person behind because that person was a strong presence in their life. So we are always encouraging the families that you got to give the patient permission, because if you give the patient permission, then they can relax and they can be at peace. And if they can relax and be at peace, then they can die more comfortably. And so, that's the kind of grief advice that we're always talking to patients and then family members about as someone's going through that process.
Yeah, definitely. Because of course it's hard, right? It's hard to watch someone die.
Right.
But I agree. I think it's very important to actually let them go in peace. And I'm sure, of course, I'm not in the field, so I don't know exactly, but I'm sure, like you mentioned, there are patients that feel guilty leaving just because of that, not because they don't want to or because they're uncomfortable, but it gets to the point that they're probably so accepting of it because they know they're not feeling good, they're not doing so well,
Right.
but they hold on for the family.
Yeah.
And the family that's grieving, you can see this even after, right? They do have that, why did they leave, the anger, the resentment, or things of that sort. So why don't you explain to us a little bit now about the grievers, or they're both grievers, but the family grieving and what they might feel and what you usually see after someone passes.
Yeah, absolutely. So the family,
even
no,
because I know anticipatory grief as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So with the family, you have anticipatory grief and reactionary grief. And so anticipatory grief is grief that a family member goes through before the patient dies. We see a lot of anticipatory grief with in hospice with patients that live for a long time. So the longer that the patient's alive, the longer we're able to work with the patient and the family to kind of assist them and provide support to them in their grieving process. They're going to go through a thing called anticipatory grief. You don't have to go through anticipatory grief. I've seen a lot of people that will just try to avoid their feelings at all cost, and then they'll have to face the reactionary grief more intensely. A common thing that we see anticipatory grief with is with families who have had a loved one with some related dementia diagnosis. Okay, so they say that dementia is like the longest goodbye because you're slowly losing that person over a long period of time. So those families have to deal with anticipatory grief for a very long time. And so their grief experience might be a little bit different, because if they're going through this grief, this anticipatory grief over a long period of time, when that patient actually dies, their reactionary grief might not be there, or it might be very, very minimal in intensity because they've already been doing the work for many, many years. So by the time the patient dies, I've actually had a lot of family members who have lost a loved one to some dementia related case that they feel a sense of relief that they don't no longer have to see this person suffer, because they had to see the person suffer and slowly lose their mental faculties for a long period of time. So they sense relief, they sense just being at peace. They were preparing themselves for years. But that's very different than, let's say, the person who just gets diagnosed with cancer and then they have a very quick trajectory and then they die maybe a month or two later, right? That family is going to have a very different experience because they didn't have the time to prepare themselves. They didn't have the luxury of being able to go through the anticipatory grief process. Most of that anticipatory grief process is going to be the shock or bewilderment, because they still can't believe that this person was walking, talking, living their life, doing everything that we would do, right? And then all of a sudden they get diagnosed with this life-limiting illness, and then they decline very quickly, and then they die just in a matter of like months. It's really hard for you to prepare for that if it happens very fast. And so their reactionary grief process is going to be very intense because they didn't get to go through the anticipatory grief process. So it really just depends. Grief is unique, as you know. Everyone's going to have a different reaction to grief. I like to say that there's really no roadmap to grief. There's no blueprint. There's no one size fits all solution. But there are commonalities, and there are healthy ways to deal with the process that I try to support and encourage and counsel people with. And so, yeah, typically family members that are dealing with grief go through shock and bewilderment. That usually happens for most people around the first month or two. And then after the shock and the bewilderment kind of wear off, they go through a great sense of probably depression. And I don't like to use the word depression lightly, and I don't mean depression in the clinical sense, more like depression in the colloquial sense of sadness, deep, intense sadness, right? They might go through deep, intense sadness. They might be angry, depending on the situation. If their loved one died suddenly and tragically, they might be angry. If they felt like their loved one didn't get all the care that they should have gotten, they might be angry. So it depends. So anger might be there, it might not be there. But they'll go through a deep sadness. Anxiety is a common thing that people experience. Their anxiety goes up, their stress goes up. Grief has physiological responses. So a lot of grievers, their eating patterns change, their sleeping patterns change. They might get stomach aches. They might get just a whole host of different physiological responses, aches and pains. So grief can do a number on the body and the mind and the soul and the spirit. It affects every part of you, not just one part of you. And so grief is a very, very intense phenomenon and experience. And so it's important that we take care of ourselves in every way possible, in all aspects.
Yeah, definitely. And what do you feel, do you know of any practical things that we can actually do maybe to help ourselves with that grieving process?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say the first thing that you need to do is acknowledge that you have grief. I think a lot of times we like to discount or we like to dismiss how we're feeling because society might tell us, oh, it's been a few weeks, you need to move on with your life. We hear so many problematic and very hurtful things from society, some from well-meaning people, some maybe not from not. But so we're dealing with the stressors of having to live in this world, but we're dealing with this deep pain. So what a lot of people try to do is they try to avoid it. They try to keep themselves busy. They try to, drink it away or, eat their feelings, as some people call it. So they're trying to find distractions in their life so that they don't have to deal with the pain. But the first thing I would say is you have to acknowledge that there is pain. Because if you don't acknowledge that there is pain, if you don't acknowledge that you are grieving, you're never going to progress forward in trying to find healing from the grief. So you need to acknowledge. The second thing you need to do is to adjust. You have to realize that grief is a lifelong journey. I think there's a lot of misconceptions where people think, oh, grief only lasts for a period of time and then it goes away. And that's not necessarily true. What's true is that the intense feelings of grief do lessen over time. And that's what people are talking about, that the intense feelings that somebody goes through at the beginning in their grieving process, over time, those feelings do decrease and lessen in intensity, especially if the person is doing the work of of acknowledging their feelings, adjusting to the reality of the situation, being aware of their feelings, working through their feelings. And I'll talk about some other practical things too, but you have to realize that acknowledging and adjusting to the reality of the situation is very important. Once you adjust to the reality that grief is a lifelong journey and I need to make space for it, then what you can do is do a grief journal, create like a memorial, like a little memorial at your home, or maybe a memorial garden. So some ritual or a grief journal, getting a grief counselor, talking it through might be helpful for some. Everyone has different learning styles. Everyone has different ways of kind of processing their emotions. Some people are very intellectual, so they like to read books or watch videos on educating themselves on how to move through the grieving process, and that helps them. Some people are very like emotionally sensitive and have this just emotional intensity, and so they want to talk to someone about it because they feel like if I could just get it out, get the words out, get my feelings out, it's no longer inside of me, just kind of festering in there and causing physical pain and emotional pain and spiritual pain, but I'm getting it out. So that way I can lay it down so that those intense feelings no longer have to limit my capacity for happiness. Some people like to work with their hands. They're very tactile. So they need tangible ways of expressing their grief. So one thing that I've done with some family members is like a legacy box. So if the patient is alive, they try to get like favorite mementos or pictures, things that remind them of the patient, and they put it in a box, and then they'll revisit the box from time to time, and it'll remind them of their loved one, and they can like process their feelings, whatever that might be, but it gives them a sense of connection to that person still, right? And it's a tangible way of doing it, so it doesn't just feel like it's some abstract concept. So a memorial garden, a life legacy box, like a little like memorial altar, like maybe just like a shelf with like pictures and other things. There's just so many practical things you could do. One other thing is doing something that the patient loved. So like say for example, the patient loved to bowl. They were an avid bowler. This person went every week, hung out with their friends, went bowling. Even if you don't like bowling, go one time and go to a bowling alley and like go bowling. And I think it's a way to honor your loved one. It's a way to remember them. And it might create that space for you to be able to remember and to feel how you're feeling. So those are just some practical ways to do it. The ways that work for me because of my learning style is I like to educate myself, and I like grief journaling. I like to write. And so writing out my feelings, anytime I'm feeling an intense grief reaction or emotional reaction, writing it down. And keeping track of how I'm feeling, and then looking back and going, wow, I might not be feeling like I'm doing great today, 3 months maybe after I lost my loved one, but I'm looking back at how I was feeling the first week or 2 weeks or a month, and I'm really seeing that I'm making progress. Yeah, it's slow progress, but I'm making progress. And that might encourage you that there's nothing wrong with you. You're just going on this journey. So honor your feelings and remember that things take time, but with action, you can increase your capacity for happiness and decrease those painful feelings that you have.
Yeah, definitely. I love the way you gave a practical tool for kind of every personality. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah,
that's awesome. So I'm
absolutely.
sure someone's going to take something from it, or everyone could take something from it, I should say.
Yeah.
So thanks for that.
No problem.
Now, I know a lot of times people deal not only with their emotion of grief, but sometimes they also have like that it's more kind of like that they feel they can't go on because they feel guilty if they're happy without the person that has passed. Yeah. They don't want to have a good time. They don't want to go out. They don't want to talk to people because they feel if they smile, if they're having a good time, it's kind of like they're forgetting their loved one. Right. Is there anything we can do or anything you can say in those terms?
That's really difficult. It's one of the most difficult things that I have to support a griever with is these feelings of guilt or these feelings of, like you said, I'm happy and I feel happy, but I shouldn't be feeling happy. They feel like it's a way of dishonoring their loved one, that if they're happy, if they're moving forward in their life and they're doing the things that they love to do, or they're just going back to all the obligations that we have as humans on a daily basis, they feel like they're dishonoring their loved one. So it comes from a place of misunderstanding what it means to honor your loved one. And a lot of people like to use the word guilt when we're talking about grief, that a lot of people have guilt, but I don't really think it's guilt. I think it's misunderstanding. I think we misunderstand our feelings. And it's really easy to misunderstand our feelings. This is not something that I'm trying to say, oh, I'm judging you because you're misunderstanding your feelings. No, we all do. Our feelings are not always necessarily rooted in a rational, realistic place. But our feelings are our feelings. So we have to still deal and process with those.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of times what I try to tell the griever, and I use this exercise not right away, but if I'm working with someone over a period of time, I might get to the point where they're going to deal with, I had a really good day for the first time in like a couple of months. I was hanging out with my friends. We had a great time. It just felt nice just to smile and to laugh and to just have a good time. And I feel so bad when I got home, I felt so guilty because I was like, why should I be having a good time? I should still be grieving my loved one. And what I like to reflect back to that person is, if you got one more opportunity to bring your loved one back and to have a conversation with them, what do you feel your loved one would say if you asked them, would you want me to continue to be sad and despondent for the rest of my life and to continue to just have these intense feelings of pain and suffering because you're no longer here? Or would you want me to move forward in my life and to have the very best life possible and to be happy and be content and have joy and have peace and good relationships and all the things that life has to offer? And I kid you not, 99% of the time, I've only had one person in the several years that I've done grief work with people, I've only had one person say something different, but every other person has said, no, my loved one would want me to be happy. They wouldn't want me to be in this state of perpetual sadness or intense feelings of guilt or despondency. They would want me to move forward in my life. They would want me to live my life. They would want me to have the very best life possible. And so when they kind of step out of themselves and they kind of put on their loved one's understanding of them, they realize, oh my goodness, my loved one would not be upset or not feel dishonored by me living a good life. They would want me to do that. They would want me to be happy. And I think that's the key. I think the key is remembering that you're not dishonoring your loved one by moving forward in your life and seeking happiness and seeking peace. You're actually honoring your loved one by doing that, because you're taking life, the life that we have here on earth, seriously. And they would want you to take life here on earth seriously, because if they probably had it their way, they would want to be back here completely healthy and living life with you. But if they no longer can, they would want you to be able to move forward.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, like you said, sometimes it's hard to see that until we take ourselves out of.
Yeah, and that can't happen right away. This is something, like I said, that it takes some time before you can get yourself, out of the situation and put yourself in a place where you can kind of do that empathetic exercise. That's not something I'm able to do right away with a griever I meet for the first time. That's something later on. But if the griever can get there and they can realize, I'm not dishonoring my loved one by living my life, I'm honoring my loved one, then their capacity for happiness can increase tremendously.
Definitely. Awesome. Now, I know you have a little something for everyone that's joining us. I know you want to share something with them. So if you want to go ahead and do that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to say thank you to each and every one of you that are watching this conversation, and just know that there are people out there that would be more than happy to help you navigate the grieving process. And so my gift to you all is you can have a first session for free. My sessions are typically 50 minutes long. And so your first session, if you want to engage with grief counseling with me, your first session is absolutely free, no charge, because it's hard for a lot of people to even take that step, right? It's hard for people to even take that step of realizing, wow, I'm really going through a difficult time and I really need some extra support. And I'm going to take that leap of faith, if you will, and really try to find someone that can help me move through this journey. And so I want to kind of take any excuse off the table for you in trying to find some help and trying to find some support. So your first session with me would be absolutely no cost. I just want to get to know you better. If you're having a difficult time, let me try to at least, assess the situation, give you space to be able to process your feelings and see if doing grief work with me might be right for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for offering that. And I'll definitely be including the link for that, so you guys can go right in and just contact him. so that you can have that first session free and see if it's something that would benefit you a bit and help you during this process. So again, thank you for that.
Yeah.
And before we go, if you had to give just one, so I
Yeah.
know you probably want to give a bunch, but if you had to give just one tip to those that are grieving right now, just one thing for them to take from this conversation, what would it be?
Oh man, that's a good question.
It's a heavy question.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I think the first thing that comes to mind is remember that you're not alone, and remember that there's nothing wrong with you. I think a lot of times as grievers, we feel so isolated, we feel so alone, we feel like there's something actually wrong with us if we're feeling this way. A lot of times we feel guilty for feeling this way, or we might feel like there's something, like I said, there's something wrong with us. But I just want to tell you, there's nothing wrong with you. You're not broken. You don't need to be fixed. This is a normal reaction to loss. And just remember that you are not alone. There are plenty of resources. There are plenty of people that would be more than willing to help you if you're having a difficult time, and that there's nothing wrong with seeking help.
It's true. Awesome. I'll let you slide with those two because those two go hand in hand and they are great. It's so true.
Yeah.
So awesome. Thank you so much, Ryan, for joining us, for not only giving your advice, but your experience both with the dying and the family, and all the grief that comes with it. Thank you for your advice and everything. It's been awesome. It's been very helpful. I'm sure everyone's really benefiting from it. So thanks again for that.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And thank you guys for watching another interview in the From Mourning to Meaning series. Hope to see you guys again tomorrow for another interview. Bye, guys.